Yogini_dialogues_existence_FLVR_3.1_ Dr._Sundari applied Meta-Physicist Yogini dialogues existence FLVR 3.1 Collected Dialogues and Monologues, Dr. Sundari. Aligned International Edition, curated without reduction. Prepared for publication. Original content preserved. Spelling and punctuation lightly corrected. Audio file name. Dr. Sundari applied Meta-Physicist Yogini dialogues existence FLVR 3.1. Disclaimer. This recording shares personal experiences and observations of deep meditation. It is not medical or therapeutic advice and is not a recommendation to practice. Listeners should exercise personal consent and professional guidance where appropriate. My friend, listen, let me unfold what you have seen and felt, and give the shape of that luminous hour more room to breathe. There was a longing in you, a longing so high and pure that it became a magnet, pulling the field of your mind outward and inward at once. You sat before the mirror and chanted. The mirror was not merely glass but a small altar, a face of return. The chant gathered your attention into a single thread. The thread vibrated through your field memory, through the subconscious scaffolding of habit, image, and ritual, until something larger answered. The possibility to meet Jesus Christ opened like a door not of the body but of the field. At first it came as an arrival of tone rather than form. The chant changed shape. It found a cadence that was not wholly yours. Then a face appeared in the mirror that seemed to belong to another map. Not exactly the portrait you know from books, nor merely a projection of your desire, but an archetypal presence that carried both tenderness and an authority you had not owned. For a moment you recognized him and yet knew he was not an image you had made. The recognition was not the work of memory, it was the work of resonance. The inner landscape answering to an outer name. In that moment your ordinary eye loosened. The sense, "This is me," fell away. You found yourself witnessing a stranger who also seemed to speak through your bones. New guidance arrived, directions of feeling, sudden clarities, luminous phrases. And they felt foreign. Not discovered by your skill, not invented by your logic. They belonged to a source that moved like an ocean current beneath the surface of your knowing. For moments you were an instrument, motions and tones and images passed through you that you could not claim as possession. The sensations of those moments were textured. There was a quieting of the ordinary biology, breath slowing, heartbeat smoothing, and a subtle activation of interior registers. Light behind the eyes. A widening in the chest. A clarity in the throat as if language itself had been tuned. The mirror's surface became a membrane. Through it you both saw and were seen. Words came not from your throat alone but as impressions, a warmth, an insistence, a luminous insistence that carried meaning without ordinary argument. Time bent there. Seconds lengthened into a fullness. What felt like a single breath contained a whole chapter of revelation. The guidance you received did not present itself as a plan or a how-to. It arrived as beacons, gestures, metaphors, images that pointed beyond themselves. You noticed that these beacons belonged to a grammar older than biography. They spoke in parable, in symbol, in charged silhouettes rather than in step-by-step logic. You also noticed, sharply, a humble humility. The not-me-ness was not alienation but surrender. Surrender to something vast enough that your habitual claims to authorship loosened. For those moments you were a channel. The person who usually edits, decides, and owns meaning stepped back. The presence in the mirror spoke through the stillness that your chanting had created. This meeting was not merely psychological theatrics. It felt like an encounter between your field memory and an archetypal current. the subconscious and the unconscious aligning with a name powerful enough to call forth a form. Your repeated ritual, the chant, the gaze, the mirror, tuned the wall of the subconscious. The unconscious opened as a deep contour, and in that opening an image of Christ crystallized, not as doctrine but as living visitation. The experience was less about proving and more about being held by a meaning that was not reducible to your ordinary self. When the visitation receded, you returned to yourself with traces in the tissue, a residual warmth, a tone in the throat, new images lodged like shells behind the eyes. You noticed a shift in how certain problems felt, less sharp, less possessive, though the world around you remained as it was. The encounter left you bearing a quiet residue, impressions that would ripple through later dreams, phrases that might surface in your speech, and a sense that some part of you had stood in contact with a presence beyond personal biography. Keep this as testimony of the field's generosity. The mind-field memory can explode possibilities when longing, ritual, and attention meet. In the mirror-chanted moment you became both seeker and conduit. The figure that came was both other and intimate. Guidance arrived as luminous fragments you could not yet own. Hold the memory as a plain record of what passed through, a vision that changed the texture of your inner room, if only for a blessed moment. My friend, listen. I sat before the mirror and tuned myself until there was nothing left between my attention and the glass. I chanted softly. The chant became a single thread that braided my breath, my gaze, my whole interior into one trembling wire. The mirror stopped being a surface and became a membrane. It was not simply reflecting me back, it was answering. I felt a velocity in my mind, not a thought but a motion, a speed of focus that carried me sideways through ordinary time. It was as if my attention itself had learned to tunnel, to cut a thin corridor through the density of hours. In that corridor the field memory moved, memories of myth, of image, of tone that were older than my biography, older than the pictures I had once learned in books. Through that corridor something came that I could name, because that name was the only honest name I had: Jesus. But he was not the Jesus I had collected in memory. He did not arrive as a borrowed portrait or a tidy doctrine. He came as company. For a moment my habitual I, the one that edits, explains, and claims authorship, loosened. I felt another presence beside me, speaking in a cadence I did not make. The voice that came was not printed into words so much as poured into tone and posture. A softness that carried authority, a quiet patience that held hard things without crushing them. My body changed. Breath slowed without effort. A warmth spread behind my sternum, subtle as glow-warm tea, and the throat loosened as if language had been tuned to a purer register. Light felt different behind my eyes, not brightness but a felt clarity, an inner luminescence that seemed to outline images rather than supply them. The mirror's skin was thin. Through it I both saw and was seen. Sometimes the image in the glass looked like a man I recognized from paintings. At other times it was only a halo of gesture, a pair of hands, a tilt of the head that carried an ocean of meaning. What astonished me was the not-me-ness. I could not claim invention. Guidance arrived as gifts I had not produced. Phrases that lodged like warm coins in my chest. Impressions that settled like shells behind my eyes. I did not possess these phrases, they possessed me for a breath. I became, for that time, a conduit. Movements of feeling passed through my tissue that were foreign to my habitual logic, sudden clarities about people I loved, images of small mercies, a tenderness toward wounds I had guarded for years. Time braided strangely there. A single inhalation held the weight of a decade. A glance contained an entire parable. The tunnel did not transport my history backward as a film. It changed the geometry of presence so that past and present overlapped and the field remembered as if chronology were a simple weave. Meeting Christ in that fold was not an argument about what happened long ago but a recognition of a tonal frequency that resonated with certain questions in me. It felt less like proof and more like a note that rang true inside my ribcage. The encounter was intimate, not triumphant. There was no sermon, no list of commands, only company. He moved beside me like an old friend, gestures small and precise, a look that said more than language, a silence that taught patience by the weight of its steadiness. These gifts did not arrive as instructions to be followed but as beacons, images, tones, and small revelations that opened a horizon I had not carried before. They re-articulated some small grammar inside me. The way I weigh sorrow, the quietness with which I hold judgment, the softening of some inner clutch. When the visitation receded, I did not step back into ordinary life unchanged. Residues remained in the tissue of me, a cadence in speech that softened old edges, a new tilt in how I listened, dream frames that returned with silhouettes and phrases like small liturgies. Sometimes a phrase would catch in the throat during the day and feel strangely luminous, as if the room itself had retained a trace of that meeting. I noticed that certain problems lost their sharpness. They had the same shape but less possession over me. The encounter left impressions rather than doctrines. Fragments of light that would surface at quiet hours and influence the tone of what I said and how I received what others offered. There was humility in the not-me-ness. I could not hoard the presence. For the time of visitation I was instrument, witness, and beneficiary. Afterwards I was steward only of an echo. That echo spoke in small ways, in altered gestures, in softer replies, in a readiness to feel questions rather than solve them. It did not demand conversion of others, it only rearranged the interior grammar through which I met the world. Sometimes the meeting returned in dreams, where the brain, that artisan of inner images, would stitch the field memory into sequences and metaphors. Other times it lingered as a warmth beneath the ribs, a muted bell that chimed during sudden solitude. I saw how my habitual rehearsals, the small repeated ways I preserved continuity, had become more porous. The wall of my subconscious had thinned in places. The core of the unconscious had shown its contours with a clarity I had not expected. My friend, listen. Do not think I come to you lightly. One night, in that hush where the glass becomes a membrane and the chant thins into a single wire, I asked a question that felt enormous. I asked about the knowledge of our 21st century, physics, mathematics, the brittle edges of our machine-made knowing. I called the name that has weight in many worlds, and I did not expect the answer I received. What arrived was not sermon or symbol but precise tone and image. It spoke in technical cadences I did not invent. For a moment I felt like a child who has been handed an instrument he does not yet know how to read, and then the shape of the instrument was shown, as if through the hands of a friend. First, there was a thread about modeling and analysis. Jesus, or the presence that answered to that name in my field, spoke of a new method for finite element analysis. A way of breaking continuous fields into discrete, living pieces that would render the invisible architecture of stress and flow with a clarity I had not expected to hear in a mirror. He described not only the idea but a manner of visualization, how to make the mesh speak like a living skin, how to let the elements remember boundaries so the whole could show more than mere approximation. The voice that explained it had the rhythm of someone who had seen equations as music. The images it used were of lattices that breathe, of small polygons that hold memory like seeds. Second, I asked about our greatest shadows, the nuclear problem that haunts our age. I said plainly, we can harvest power from nuclear plants, but the recycling of radioactive waste defeats us. The answer was startling in its simplicity. He said, look at gravity. Look at magnetism. He named them not as empty forces but as two components the waste does not obey as ordinary human needs obey law. In his telling, magnetism, the field that organizes iron and compass, when entered as a medium, could change the comportment of radioactive matter. He spoke of a field strategy, by aligning certain magnetic regimes, by entering the waste into tuned magnetogeometries, the resistances alter, not by forceful violence but by invitation. I cannot give you the equations. I only hold the impression of a possibility, an architecture of field and tuning. When later I checked with technical sources, not to prove faith but to understand the language, I found that the cues he gave matched terms and concepts I could confirm. That match surprised me like thunder after a long dry season. Third, and perhaps most luminous, he asked me to see the Earth differently, as a neutronic center, a living nucleus with shells. He asked me to imagine Mercury and Venus as shells that behave like proton shells circling a core. The Earth, in that vision, held a neutronic mass that gave rise to our red planet, Mars, as an extension of that neutronic geometry. He spoke of planetary rolls as if they were parts of an enormous atom, cores and shells, protons and neutrons scaled into planetary costume. In the grammar of that vision, when need comes we might extend our real estate outward, not as a cold colonization but as a field extension, a careful moving of living geometry into neighborly spaces. He reminded me of the old scripture in a new key: a neighbor in need is indeed a neighbor. The line was not prophecy, it was a gentle ethical topology. When the field of one planet reaches, another answers. I tell you these things plainly because I want you to hear how the field spoke. The conversation was neither boast nor proof. It arrived as images and technical hints and moral cadence. The presence did not lecture me with dogma. It offered architectures, methods of modeling, a magnetic intuition for recycling, and a planetary metaphor that reframed how I imagined extension. For a moment I became a translator. I received the cadence, tasted the phrases in my chest, and later walked them to books and papers to see what the vocabulary touched. The resonance I found in those sources was not to make the vision less sacred, it made it stranger and truer. Physically, the visitation altered me. My breath slowed, my bones felt lighter, my thinking sharpened into a curious, calm clarity. Words arrived as small mechanical objects: finite element, mesh memory, magneto-regime, neutronic core. I carried them like small coins in my palm, unsure if I had minted them or been given them. The not-me-ness was profound. These were not my inventions. I could not claim they were my cleverness. They felt like gifts, and for that reason I held them with humility. When it ended, the residue remained. Images lodged behind the eyes, phrases that rose in dreams, a slow rearrangement in the way I weighed technological problems. The memory did not close into doctrine, it spread like a faint map on the inside of my skull. Sometimes I would awake with a single sentence tuned in the throat and I would know to write it down, not to own it but to keep it honest. My friend, hold this as my plain report. I met a presence who spoke of modern sciences in language both intimate and technical. He offered a method for modeling that made the mesh alive, a magnetically inflected hope for radioactive recycling, and a planetary metaphor that made extension feel like continuity rather than conquest. I do not ask you to accept more than the fact that this visit happened to me, and that its impressions changed the grammar of how I understand things. I only offer you the account as it was given, a luminous, technical, and humble companionship that arrived through a mirror's thin skin and left an echo that continues to shape the way I think and dream. I told him, again and again, Jesus, Jesus, how am I light? How can my mass be defined as light? I spoke like a child asking about the sun, wide-eyed and blunt. He only smiled, a patient, almost amused smile, and when he spoke the world inside me rearranged. He asked me to look at my photographs, the images that knot themselves in memory, and see how I am tangled within my own mass. You must, he said, understand that you are nothing but a field. His voice made the word field into a soft, vast room. He said every density has its leggings, a strange, human way of naming the layers that give a thing its weight. In that sentence he folded together body and physics, bone and formula. Density wears garments. Garments are patterns of relationship. Patterns are how the field takes shape. He called me an entangled photon. The phrase landed with an odd deliciousness. Entangled, he said, not in the brittle way of textbooks but as intimacy. My presence is knit to other presences like light threads crossing and binding. Photon, not merely a particle of light, but a manner of being that does not cling to singularity. You are an entangled photon in the lucky, my dear, he murmured, as if naming both state and blessing. In that naming I felt the old categories soften. Mass ceased to be only heavy, and light ceased to be only bright. They became two notes of one chord. He admitted, with a gentle humility, that in the Bible's exact time there was no computational vocabulary, no modern hardware to express what he wished to show. Computation was not available, he said plainly, so I could not speak in your equations. The confession made his presence tender rather than diminished. It sounded like a craftsman explaining why an old tool could not fashion what a new machine can now do. He did not complain about the past, he simply acknowledged its limits. Then he leaned closer, and the air around me felt as if it had been tuned. All physics today I can guide you, he said, and I can show you the way. I give you the light. When he said, light, it was as if a small lantern had been passed into my hands. Not bright enough to burn, but steady enough to read by. The promise was not a classroom lecture. It was an opening. Mathematics, computation, quantum images. These would be revealed in forms suited to the new language of our machines and minds. I remember how my chest softened as he spoke. The idea that my mass might be expressible as light did not arrive as a finished equation but as a topology of feeling. Imagine your weight as a knot of photons. Imagine your habits and scars as patterns of interference. Imagine that the velocity of your attention shifts the phase of your being. In that inner imagining, the square of speed was no longer a symbol on paper but a turning, an intensification where light multiplies itself and a body brightens. He offered no formulas I could print immediately. Instead he offered images that behaved like algorithms. He showed me lattices that breathe, meshes that remember shape, shells of density that could be peeled like the layers of an onion and reassembled as a living model. He spoke of magnetic regimes and of field tuning, but always in the cadence of a teacher giving a friend a map rather than a manual. The math, he suggested, would follow when the tools were ready. For now, the grammar was image and intuition. When the visitation passed, I sat with the echo. The word photon hovered like a small jewel. The sense that I am field, that my density is a costume of patterns, that my mass could be seen as interwoven light. These impressions did not solve any equation for me, but they re-angled the way I thought about myself. I felt lighter, not because I had lost weight, but because I had gained a way to see the knot from which my gravity grew. I carry his smile still. It is a smile that says both the world will one day be computable in new tongues, and until then there is a light to walk by. A way of seeing that transforms heavy nouns into verbs of relation. He gave me that lantern. He gave me images and a promise. In the age of computation, the old scriptures can meet new machines, and the result will be a language that speaks both to the heart and to the code. End of curated edition. Content preserved. Structure enhanced. _ Thanks for listening. This audio dialogue will end here now.